Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Bunker Show. We're here in the deep, dark recesses underneath the sewers of Westminster to bring you the latest information on some of the subjects that the mainstream don't cover. And joining me today in the bunker is the lovely, smiley Helen. Hello, Helen.
Evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Really looking forward to tonight's show. It's going to be a really interesting one. Don't forget to come into the Dark City chat room and you can ask questions, give feedback on the show. I'll ask your questions on air and we'll do our best to answer them. So hope you join me in there now.
And joining us, as always, in the Bunker Show is Jimmy.
Howdy, Fabrice and Helen. And yeah, it's great to be back. And I'm really interested in what's going to be illuminated tonight, because it's some areas that we haven't covered yet, isn't it?
There's a few things that we've been meaning to look at, and we've been very, very lucky because today we were due to have David Henke as our guest from XRO News, and unfortunately he's not able to be with us until next week due to the fact that he's being involved in a court case involving Ben Fellows at the Old Bailey. So David will be with us next week, and I'm really, really, really pleased and personally very grateful to our guest this evening, Andrew Johnson, who's joining us in the bunker. Andrew is an author of book 9/11 Finding Truth. He's got a background in physics, science, computer science, and software engineering. So he's used to working with facts and evidence and hard science, which is the sort of thing that we like here in the Bunker Show. So Andrew, thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, thanks very much for inviting me onto your program.
And how did you manage to research and spend so much time looking into the subjects that you look into, which are the kind that don't seem to be covered by a lot of the mainstream media?
I think it was a combination of things, really, because the way it started off for me, I suppose, was I had a UFO sighting when I was about 9-10 years old of a star-like object, which clearly wasn't a star because it was doing acrobatics around another star-like object, which clearly wasn't a star. And I was with a school friend, and we both saw that, I think, about 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, and it was around about 1974, that sort of time frame. And I've always had an interest in, sort of what we might call paranormal, or I've always sensed that there are things going on, in the world which they don't really give you the full picture of. So that kind of set the scene.
And I can see how that would do that. I had a sighting myself with two people who I know, and it was again something that you don't usually see in the sky. So when you have sort of first-hand experience of that, it really does provoke your mind into trying to find the answers, or at least work out what the appropriate questions are. So how did that experience? Right. Yeah, how did that experience sort of engage you further?
Well, it was. I mean, obviously, I was quite young then, so you tend to be a bit more sort of matter of fact about things at that age. I'd been given, and somebody gave me for a birthday present a little book that had stuff about UFOs in it. It was a children's book. It was called Space Fact and Fiction, as I recall. And there's some bits of astronomy in it, and then it had some stuff about, I think it had some stuff about George Adamski in it, as I recall. And but I'd always had that interest there, and I suppose that what set me on the current path was in 2003 when I discovered this thing called the Disclosure Project, which maybe we'll talk a little bit more about later on. And that was this effort by Stephen Greer to bring together I think something like 400 or 500 very well qualified witnesses, military people that worked for the Civil Aviation Authority, pilots, people who were good observers, trained observers,
And the sorts of
with
people who would be trusted to make sure the aeroplane that you fly on holiday is well engineered, and that
right.
military weapons are secured, because they even had people who were working securing nuclear weapons at the
That's
disclosure
right.
project.
I mean, Major George Filer is an example. He still runs a UFO news bulletin, which he sends out, I think, every week or two to people that want it. And he said in his testimony that, look, I've been given clearance to be in charge of nuclear weapons, but when I tell stories about UFOs, people think I'm a bit crazy, And he was ordered to chase a UFO when he was flying. I forget the exact in the US somewhere, I understand. And so that was the sort of caliber of witnesses that Greer had managed to assemble. And he did this press conference in 2001 at the National Press Conference Club, Washington, D.C. You can watch all of that online. It's still all available for those that are not familiar with it. It is worth watching, although it does go on a bit because the whole thing's about 2 hours long, and it is just people talking essentially, but it is very compelling testimony. But I didn't discover that, you see, until 2003. And so, of course, 2 years had elapsed. This, to me, was a major event. I'd not really seen anything about it in any of the mainstream media. So it was really then in 2003 that I realized there really was a cover-up of important information to do with, ETs, aliens, flying saucers, whatever name you want to give it, and raise a few eyebrows, I'm sure, as one does. And that's when I kind of started to, I downloaded this video, I put it onto a laptop, I bought one of these LCD projectors, and, I booked a couple of rooms, in Derby and this sort of thing, and tried to get people to come and see this film. That was me sort of trying to be in my own way then proactive, and
Yeah.
take this information out to people.
And did you find that was a good way of engaging people or raising awareness? Because the Disclosure Project, though it was fairly well attended, especially for an event of that kind in its time, it was somewhat lost in the news cycle, and was given a bit of a media sort of spin to it, which often seems to be a reoccurring theme. But did you find, because the number of people who have actually seen things that is quite unexplained in the sky is quite high, but people generally don't talk about it too often?
Well, I think, you've raised obviously a couple of things there. I think it got a reasonable amount of press coverage in the US. It got very little over here. That much I do know. So yes, I think that it did have a news cycle, which I think probably lasted a couple of weeks. And I did get in contact with one of the witnesses called Dan Willis, and he and I did speak quite a lot, actually, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now. And I recorded an interview with him, and he told me, that they kind of did a US tour after the press conference. I think that lasted probably a couple of weeks, and they took 2 or 3 of the witnesses and did a few news broadcasts and that sort of thing in various places. But yeah, you do get, when I actually showed this film, I didn't get much of a response. I ended up sort of booking a couple of rooms and nobody turned up, because all I had was my own resources to try and advertise this, and I'm not skilled. Those are not my skills, as you said in the introduction, my background is computer programming, which is actually, quite an introverted activity, as I'm sure you are aware. So I wasn't really that used to going out and making marketing materials or advertising materials and things like that. I had no experience of that. And that still remains one of the issues with this whole area. We were talking about Richard D. Hall, who is incredibly resourceful, and he's developed this strategy for, building this whole vehicle for himself to carry forward this information. And I just can't. I've just no ability to do what he's done, in that way. And that's one of the problems. But then, when I showed the film and when a few people did turn up, some of them would say, "Oh yeah, and I saw this, flying over my back garden a few years ago, and it was clearly not a plane." So these stories do come out, as you say, and I think Stanton Friedman, who's one of the other very well-known, long experienced UFO researchers, he says when he gives all these talks, he says how many people have seen a UFO, and 70% of the audience will put the hand up, and then you'll say how many of you reported them to some official body, and nearly all the hands go down.
And
so
yeah, I was going to say that the whenever I ask that question of somebody, and I usually do it when it's just them and I. My second question is, has anybody ever, have you ever told anybody about that before?
Mm-hmm.
Or has anybody ever asked you that question before? And it's invariably no. So it's not one of those sort of over the dinner table conversations, I guess.
No, not always. I mean, it depends what you're talking about. And I think what I've come to find is that there are certain topics which are taboo for a lot of people. I mean, it's okay to talk about lights in the sky, even to talk about landings. People don't have a problem with that. But if you start talking about these aliens actually coming out of the craft and doing things and interacting with humans, that's when people start to get a little bit more, that can't be true kind of thing, or and they become more uncomfortable or more challenged by that side of things. And then, of course, when you get into the accounts of abductions and people having, being pregnant and then waking up the next morning and not being pregnant anymore, having had an abduction experience, that's when you're getting into the really strange experiences that people find extremely uncomfortable to start talking about.
It's quite interesting, Andrew, when you think about the Steven Spielberg film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I think one of the areas that he really nailed right on the head was the shared empathy that people who experience alien encounters share. And it's interesting to think that I think through these encounters, people seem compelled to actually go further with their research, because I too have had an experience. I mean, nothing of any earth-shattering import, but when you mentioned your experience, it's very similar to what I saw in Wagga Wagga in 1997 in the night sky, stars dancing, doing things that they really should not be able to do.
Yeah, and I mean, I've had 3 other sightings since then. But I think going back to the Disclosure Project, if you listen to all the witness testimony and you listen to the sorts of things which they've been saying, and one of the other people that we mentioned in before we came on air was Edgar Fouché, and he wasn't a Disclosure Project witness, but he could have been. He was in the right caliber of people.
He's very well documented his experience, and that he was effectively a hotshot pilot for the US military when they had exotic projects that needed putting back on course.
Well, he wasn't a pilot as such. I think he may have done a little bit of flying early on, but he took an injury, so he ended up working in cryptographics and cryptographic systems. And I've interviewed Edgar Fouché for several hours, and he gave me copies of the documents, and from everything that he told me, I couldn't find anything that was untrue. And he said, for example, that he was given a document by one of his associates who he called Dale. I don't think that was his real name. And his father, Dale's father, who had worked for the NSA for 30 years, the NSA is the National Security Agency, had given him this document, which was labelled Attachment D, and it was actually a report about the autopsy of an alien being, I believe from the Roswell crash. And then this tied into what had been given to Jamie Shandera with the so-called majestic documents. And Edgar Fouché also told me that alien autopsy film that came out in 1996, I think it was, the Ray Santilli film, that was deliberately released as a fake because the original film had gone missing. They didn't know where it was, and so they released this fake film, or they set that up as a cover project for somebody to make that film and release it into the community, so that it could easily be discredited in case the real one showed up somewhere, and then they could say, oh yeah, well that's obviously fake as well. So that gives you an example of how disinformation works, and I think he was telling the truth about that.
And also the level of security clearance that some of these witnesses have, and also the the level that they're being treated in terms of how seriously the people who are using that information, that knowledge, or are running that project, how seriously they take their work.
Absolutely.
And so the military. Also, in terms of the money that these projects must cost, or in some cases must make.
Yes. I mean, that's really, I think, some of the key areas that aren't discussed that much. The black budget programs, and we're talking trillions of dollars potentially, maybe certainly in the tens of billions. And this is something that Stephen Greer brought up in the Disclosure Project, which is where I'd started to hear numbers being put on these things, and for example, some of his witnesses said that they worked on black programs. They were unacknowledged special access programs, or USAPs, and you find that they've all got these acronyms such as USAP, an unacknowledged special access program. And when you start to listen to these testimonies, hours and hours of them, you begin to realize that there is a hidden world which you have no knowledge. Politicians have no knowledge, and I think one of the clips was Senator Daniel Inouye from the 1980s, where he was saying he said this in the Senate, in the US Senate, and he said there was a shadowy government with its own police, its own air force, and they were able to completely section off things into a completely secret, environment, that we would have no knowledge that such things went on. And what I've come to understand is that includes weapon systems. These are developed in black programs. And now people might think, well, how do you know that? And I will say, well, because of what happened on 9/11. And this I found is a huge taboo subject.
Yeah, it's one that I found very interesting, because initially I knew that steel reinforced buildings don't collapse, and they definitely don't collapse that way. And for me, what clicked was in the mid 70s, the British Armed Forces used, I think they were classified as sonic weapons, against the Irish Republican Army in the Troubles, and they were anti-personnel sort of direct energy weapons that would make the person sweat, want to lose the contents of their stomach in any way possible, feel nauseous, and want to lie down, and that was being tested in the 70s. So it in relation to 9/11, that was the thing that made me think, there's more going on here, because you've looked into 9/11 very thoroughly.
I have, yeah, and I think I openly admit, and I say whenever I give these talks, I was completely taken in by the official story. Pretty much, I think I had a couple of little dings in my mind that something wasn't quite right, but you must have heard the expression trauma-based mind control.
Yes,
and we've used that in the different context of things like MK Ultra and that sort of thing. But I think what they showed on TV on 9/11 was global trauma-based mind control. It was like MK Ultra, expanded into a global phenomena, a global sort of program that people were put into this trauma. They saw these horrible things happening, and then they were put into this state of kind of, oh my God, the world's ending kind of thing.
It was
and then they implanted the story into the people's minds at that point, and that was job done.
Well, it was incredible because all the symbolism seemed to play into the narrative of the time, with the Bush presidency, so it was all there.
One thing I became aware of was when I went online to speak to American friends of mine, and there were a few questions that I thought were a little bit odd. The reaction I got back from people who I've been conversing with, on a weekly level, was really very, very different, and I became very aware that it was an incredibly touchy subject.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly, it is one that creates extreme polarization. I think it's a little bit different now in that more people are willing to at least kind of, listen to what you say about 9/11, and because a lot of time has passed now, there's not quite perhaps such a violent reaction to bringing it up as a topic of skepticism. But nevertheless, some people will not. If you say to them, for example, as I've come to know and understand, that there weren't any real plane crashes on 9/11, most people still find that difficult to sort of accept. They think that's crazy. Even people that have actually studied 9/11 a bit and realised the official stories cannot be true, they still have a hard time if you say to them, no, those plane crashes were not real.
I mean, the thing is when you have questions like that. I mean, how did half of Building 4 disappear, and where did it go? Because there was no rubbish there. There was nothing there.
That's it.
And if you, like I said, I mentioned it to people, and it was, and it's.
Can't look at it. Yeah, you could. They'll just whoosh. It's gone. In other words, the way I've heard it expressed by other people is it's a consciousness related issue in that in looking at all of this stuff, common law or these other topics that people, the banking system, the way that religion has been manipulated and set up over the centuries, cancer treatments, all of these topics. When you sort of scratch the surface and look through, your consciousness begins to change, and the sort of person you are on your outlook on the world changes. And it's this shift in consciousness which happens. Some people it happens quite quickly. It can happen almost overnight, and for others it can take quite a number of years. That when your consciousness reaches a certain state, then you become ready to accept new information or certain information which you just couldn't comprehend it before. It just bounces off or goes over the top of your head. There is definitely something like that going on in terms of the shift in consciousness. I'm not really talking about a global shift in consciousness particularly. I'm a little bit skeptical about that. What I'm talking about is more on a personal level, and when you learn certain things. I think somebody's typed in the chat room. Yes, it does. It happens at different times of your life and for different reasons.
It's incredible that the way you describe it, because I think it's such a shared feeling amongst a lot of people, and through the power of the internet and social networking, this is where there is a general awareness growing. Would you agree that there is becoming a general consensus within society that things just ain't as they appear?
I don't know what I tend to think at the moment, really, from my sort of standpoint, is that it's becoming more polarized. I think there are quite a lot of more knowledgeable people who are actually looking, finding, thinking, and working things out. There's a growing number of them, but there are seemingly a growing number of people also who just don't want to look or don't have any time to look. There's less middle ground now than there was, perhaps. I don't know.
I suppose when you have a higher information flow, you have sometimes to find the concentrated information is often harder. But one of the things that we try and push forward with the Bunker Show is the questions that stand up. Because even if I couldn't ask about World Trade Center 4 in 2001 or 2002, now it's 2015. It's still a very good question.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the way I look at it, I've become a little bit jaded over the years. I certainly, on the positive side, I do get a few more people writing to me now and asking. I've had like I was mentioning just before we came on, I've had a few emails about the moon landing stuff, and the skepticism on that. But basically, I'm thinking about, for example, the Kennedy assassination. That's now over 50 years since that happened. Yet still no one has been prosecuted for that. We still have no official acknowledgement that Lee Harvey Oswald couldn't have killed Kennedy.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well, because if I live to be 92 years old, I think I'm going to be able to see the released archives, or at least some of them, in relation to the Kennedy assassination. And in a way, 9/11 was very much like that kind of shock event. And when you have that, and when you, and this is where I was saying with the questions that are pertinent with John Kennedy, and the questions that are pertinent with 9/11 are still pertinent today. And I think there is an undercurrent of people who are just in amongst all the hype are looking for the questions to those anomalies. And you mentioned the moon landings earlier, because I mean you've come across some of those anomalies in relation to both the moon and Mars.
Yeah, we have. I mean, I think also before we mentioned that, I think one of the areas which I seem to be one of almost the only person that will talk about it, maybe apart from Richard, is some of the characters involved. I mean, for example, Stephen Greer, who I was very much in admiration of for the Disclosure Project. Yeah. He has connections to NASA, but Stephen Greer will not talk about 9/11. He will not talk about, for example, the connection of Science Applications International Corporation to the events of 9/11. All right. And Science Applications International Corporation were one of the defendants in Judy Wood's Keatam case for science fraud, because the Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC, they contributed to the NIST reports, the technical reports, right? And why I mention that in relation to Stephen Greer is that witnesses in his Disclosure Project testimony, this 200-page document he's got, they mention SAIC 5 times as big benefactors of the black budget, So that's got to be a red flag, I would have thought, for any honest investigator looking at that, saying, hang on, surely there's got to be a connection here between SAIC and black budget programs on 9/11. That means there must be a connection between what happened on 9/11 and black budget programs,
Yeah.
And similarly, people like Edgar Mitchell. I've just published an article about Edgar Mitchell, the alleged Apollo 14 astronaut. Mm-hmm. Now, it turns out, for example, that in a BBC documentary in 2013, Edgar Mitchell essentially admitted that in 1972 he was working for the CIA. And in 2001, I think it was, or 2000, when he did this interview with Bart Sibrel at Edgar Mitchell's home, he ends the interview after Sibrel has basically said to him, "You never walked on the moon," kicks Sibrel up the backside, and as he's leaving the house, his son says, "Shall we call the CIA and have him waxed?" As in having Sibrel waxed. Yeah. And what the hell's going on? Yet this guy, Edgar Mitchell, he's running this Institute of Noetic Sciences. He founded that allegedly in 1972 after having this transcendental experience on the way back from the moon, according to him. Yeah. Who is this guy? Who are these people?
I believe that interview's in the. I think it's available on YouTube in Apollo Zero. I believe it's in Apollo Zero.
And it's in Astronauts Gone Wild. If anybody's not seen that film, it's one of these films that not many people talk about in the Apollo apologists, as I call them.
Well, another thing that people don't talk about is Freemasonry, but we do talk about that on the Bunker Show, because they seem to crop up in all kinds of odd enterprises where there's lots of valid questions to be asked.
Absolutely.
And, as far as I'm aware, there's quite a number of Freemasons who are astronauts. Is that right?
All of them. Yeah, all of them are astronauts. All the astronauts are Freemasons. Yeah, and I mean that raises an interesting point about Buzz Aldrin, because I stumbled across an article. Buzz Aldrin is allegedly the second man to walk on the moon, or on the Hollywood set, as it seems to have been. He said that he'd, in this interview with Alex Jones that he did, I think in like 2010 or 2011, Alex Jones brings up the topic of Freemasonry and says, "I understand that there was Masonic influence in NASA, and could you confirm that?" And Aldrin says, "No, there isn't any, and I didn't take a Masonic flag to the moon." Yet on another website you can find a letter with Aldrin's signature on it, saying that, written to the Grand Masonic Lodge, that he was honoured to carry the Masonic flag on Apollo 11 to the moon. I mean, he didn't go to the moon, that's another story, but the fact that he told one story to Alex Jones and another to this letter to the Masonic Lodge, he's obviously lying in one way or the other.
And if they have associations to the CIA, or in this country, it would be the security services, MI5, MI6 are our equivalents. And there's been enough allegations that they're interlinked with Freemasonry in a way which may not be entirely above board. And with links to the intelligence services and black budgets you mentioned as well. And so, I mean, in terms of when there are, as we mentioned earlier, films released, that must cost money.
Oh, so, definitely, yeah. You know, and I mean, this is the thing. I think that a lot of the black budget programs and black technologies, people they just have no awareness of these things because it's just so rarely discussed. You know. And I think one of the things with Edgar Fouché, why he decided to disclose, and he wishes he hadn't really because of what problems it has caused him. You know, in 1998, he came forward with this information about the flying triangle craft that he'd collected over the years.
Yeah.
But his reason for coming forward was because he genuinely felt that the technology that he'd become party to, that he knew existed and he knew was real, could completely change the world. You know, it would change everything. It would mean we didn't need roads, we didn't need the energy systems that we've got that pollute the environment and destroy the environment and this sort of thing. You know, he realized that in the mid 90s, and he felt that he had to tell people that this was what was at stake. You know, he didn't say that quite as overtly as that, but that's essentially what he was saying.
How far back do you think the U.S. government was was withholding technology for? You know, like how far back do you think he was holding our current state of technology?
Well, I mean, you know, again, you listen to some of the statements, which I think one of them, I think the reasonably well accepted ones is the statement by Ben Rich, the former head of Lockheed Skunk Works, which is really the sort of black budget arm of Lockheed Martin, who work on a lot of the secret aircraft, such as in the past, I was pretty sure it was them that worked on the SR-71, which came out in the 70s. And he said that they had the technology to take ET home, you know, and that was in 1993. And I think that's probably right, you know.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well. I mean, when I was a kid, I used to like aeroplanes, especially ones that went kind of fast. And there was an aeroplane called the XB-70. A test bomber that rode across on its own shockwave, and this thing was cancelled. And we had a plane over here called the TSR-2, which was like a slightly smaller version, but it looked like a bit of a Concorde type, and they just disappeared. So when Edgar Fouché pops up and says, actually those went dark, and now look, you've got stealth bombers. Where do you think they came from? You know,
absolutely. You know, and I've said in a couple of the Apollo presentations that I've done that I essentially think that Apollo is kind of like a diversionary public relations program, in that, you know, oh wow, you know, we're sending men to the moon with these rockets and stuff. Wow, and all the scientists that they employed and all the research that was done. You know, I think that part was real, but what that was then essentially a kind of smokescreen for the secret space program. So while all the public eyes were focused on Apollo and the related programs, you know, up to Skylab in the 70s and the shuttle, oh, you know, wow, that's space travel, we're in space and we're doing all these things, you know, they could just get on with the black budget programs pretty much undisturbed.
It's interesting because you're saying virtually that the black budget actually requires a media face to front it.
Yeah, I think it does, and that Apollo was it, I think, or a big part of it. And then all the cracks they can just fill in with, you know, media hype or media cover-up. You know, as you say, the secret networks like the Freemasons, they can use those networks to sort of manipulate things where they need to, because, as you know, the Masons, they generally invite people in who are people of, you know, good standing in society, they're influential, they're smart, you know. So when they get into this sort of routine of exchanging favors, that's one of the ways they can get things done, you know. I'm not saying that Freemasons are the only network that are involved in getting these things done secretly, because there are others. There's Knights of Malta, and I think there's all these other societies like the Henry Jackson Society and the Fabian Society and all these sorts of groups,
And
Tavistock Institute and so on.
yeah, and there's also a number of people who've been awarded honours recently whose conduct has most seriously come into question, and I think that the public is starting to realise that there are serious questions with why and how some of these people managed to get into those positions, especially when you have as we were talking about Edgar Fouché and some of the counselled experimental aircraft, or in the end experimental spacecraft, because Edgar Fouché maintained that what the XB-70 used to be was used as a platform for a low Earth orbit vehicle.
That's right, yeah. And they were launching satellites with this vehicle, by flying them up on the back of a large sort of high-flying plane, which could then launch a smaller plane into orbit,
Yeah, I think it was an aircraft that rode on its shockwave that pushed it.
Yeah.
Past
Scram.
Mach
They call
3.
this thing a scram. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So when you see that kind of ability to keep things dark and to keep things hidden and to get the massive amounts of money without oversight, it gives much more credence to things such as why haven't we been back to the moon?
Oh yeah, and I mean that's another thing which I found. Somebody sent me a link to a fairly recent article about that, and it's on the allist.com website. I mean, anybody, as I'll say, anybody that that's listening that wants information on any of these topics that we've discussed, just contact me through checktheevidence.com, and I'll send you the links to whatever articles. But this particular article was basically a very simple one, very well written, and all it did was it looked at the dates of the Apollo program, when the program started, when they put the first thing in the Earth orbit, when they put the first thing in lunar orbit, and then when they landed, and looked at the elapsed time, which was essentially 8 years between the start of the program in 61 and the landing in 69. And then it compared it with the rebooted space program, which Bush announced. It's called the Constellation program, I think, if I've got the name right, in 2004. Looked at the timescales for that, and they were about double what the Apollo timescale was. And then that program got rebooted again by Obama in 2010. It's called the Orion program now. That's one of the code names. And some of them, they haven't even got a projected moon landing date now. It's not even on the cards. They've got a re-entry. They've done a re-entry of an empty craft. But what's been going on? I mean, we did all of this in 69. We've got advanced digital technology, better materials, etc., etc. Yet it's taken twice as long to go to the moon.
And especially when you consider that the quality of some of the probes we have, a probe out by Pluto, which is
allegedly, yes, yeah.
There's also been more and more pictures of our solar system that have been coming through, and you've looked at quite a few of those and picked out some interesting anomalies with those.
Yes, that's another area which I spent quite a lot of time dipping into and out of over the years. Again, people have sent me stuff, and I've tried to, because I mean, there's a couple of, this is typical, this particular topic, say, of Mars anomalies, as I just term them. There's one particular website called, I think it's called marsanomalies.com. And I've looked at that website a few times, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think there's some very interesting stuff on there, and then stuff which I don't think is very inconclusive. So you do get a bit of a mixed bag. But for example, this image of the dome, which I use on my Skype image, you probably see it on the screen there for my image.
Yeah.
And that's from Mars. That's from there was an image of that originally taken in 1999, I think it was, or 2001, by Mars Global Surveyor, and then it was re-imaged by the HiRISE camera on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2008. So that was about 9 or 10 years later. And if you look at that picture in close up, you can clearly see it's a symmetric dome. It has like this what looks like a tube protruding underground at the top of it.
It reminds me of a geodesic dome of the sort that Richard Buckminster
exactly.
Fuller designed.
That's right. That's right.
And it's also part of a what I call the Mars film strip, where there's a sequence of anomalies all within a relatively short space.
That's exactly right. Yes. And I made a little video of this strip. I downloaded that strip and then I did a little, flyover type thing. I just did it with the Sony Vegas video thing. And you can see, as you say, all these anomalies, and it looks like there's glass domes on there and all kinds of things. And then, of course, there's allegedly this face on Mars, which was discovered in 1976, I think, or maybe a bit later in 79. I can't remember the exact date. And there is clearly, when you look at these images, we have a situation. Either we have real images with real things on them which people are not talking about, or as Richard Hall and I did this program a while ago. If you take the Apollo fakery line, then you say that, for example, these Mars rovers are not really on Mars. They're in a desert somewhere or in the Arctic region, and they're sending back pictures from a remote location that nobody visits. And I'm still a bit 50-50 on that particular one. I know they didn't land on the moon, and I could cite several which are what I think are slam dunk pieces of evidence from NASA's own record to do with that. But the rovers thing, I'm not entirely sure about. And then if you accept that the Apollo is fake and possibly the rovers are fake, then are these space probes actually where they say they are, or are they just generating some fancy images from a fancy 3D computer model which look like they're around these objects? At the moment, I happen to think that the probes really are where they say they are, but I'm not so sure about the landers. I think the probes really are orbiting these planets. But of course, we have no verification. We only have ESA and NASA. Those are the only two sources of information.
And they're
both
these images. Data, aren't they? Really?
Essentially, yes. And in the case of the Mars images, they're actually released through a private company, or that was the arrangement a few years ago. I don't know if it still is. Through Mailing Space Science Systems, and not many people are aware of that. That this company releases the images after a period of time, and then it gives them to NASA. So what's that about?
So these are more of these private companies that used to be state assets, or were even set up as private companies. We had Gordon Bowden on a month or two ago, and he was talking about boiler room companies and sometimes their involvement with intelligence and black budgets. And we also spoke about defence backhanders with Martin Summers. And in terms of companies like Kinetic, who used to be the Porton Down Research Institute, being sold for 130 odd million pounds to people who are vetted by the Ministry of Defence, and it now being worth well in excess of 10 times that. So you can turn 10,000 into 100,000 by being on board for that kickback.
So, absolutely, yeah. And I think that Kinetic was sold to the Carlyle Group, wasn't it? Which was, or part of it was taken over by Carlyle, which was George Bush's family company.
And that's right. And I think some of Osama bin Laden's family invested in it prior to 2001. And I think John Major is one of their international directors.
Is he really? I didn't know that. Crikey.
I just wanted to add to what Fabrice was saying, because I think the path that Fabrice is taking and what you're agreeing with is actually one of the answers to the question of why we haven't gone back to the moon, or why aren't we actually going to Mars. And I think it comes back to, we don't need that sort of spectacle anymore. It's more, we've got the establishment, or the powers that be, have the freedom of using the economy as their big spectacle and being able to sink huge holes in the budget to create these black economies.
I tend to agree, yes. And I think, obviously the political landscape is a lot different now to what it was like in the 60s. I mean, essentially, the essential reason for the alleged moon landings was that they beat the Ruskies, and we don't have that anymore. So
yeah, and that again, that was part of the media program. We spoke about 9/11 and the impact that some of these global spectaculars can have. But
think about how much money we lost in 2008. Where does that all go? It magically away. It's very convenient.
Well, a lot, it's just fake money anyway. I mean, I tell my children that, money doesn't grow on trees. It's created out of thin air.
Yeah,
it's true.
It's magicked on computer screens. But when you consider that it's those kind of companies that are managing images like the NASA images, then it does bring into to question some at least some of what we're being told and how it's portrayed. I mean, there was recently a lander that landed on a comet recently.
Yeah, the Philae lander, and the probe which went, I forget the name of the comet. It was called something like Comet 6710P or something. That was its real name.
Something, yeah.
And yes, allegedly this ESA probe flew to the comet over a period of 10 years, having been quote unquote asleep for most of that time. They woke it up. It went into orbit around the comet, and then the Philae lander detached and bounced on the surface, apparently due to the microgravity, and sent back a few pictures. And again, I tend to think that probe is real. I do think it did what it said, but I think what they're trying to cover up there is what comets actually are. There appears to be some kind of problem with knowing what comets really are, and I think it's to do with, it actually comes back to energy, which is what 9/11 is. The big secret about 9/11 is the energy issue. We talked about directed energy weapons very, very briefly, and I think that's also part of the secret to do with comets, because for people that want to look into this, look into the Electric Universe, which they have a very, very good video about comets and how the mainstream always talks about comets as being dirty snowballs.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing I found when I heard the reports of the comet landing on it.
Exactly, and if you look at that probe, the Philae lander, there's almost no water on it. There's virtually no ice. It's a rocky surface. There's no obvious, the sun-facing side has jets of gas coming out, but so does the area which is not facing the sun. And this is one of the things which they can't explain. But the Electric Universe people say that it's an electrical interaction from the solar wind which is driving what happens on the comet. And I think they're right. I think there is. The standard model of astronomy, the shape of the universe is driven by gravity and gravity alone, and that's basically it. Everything that you see is shaped by gravity. But the Electric Universe people say, no, that's not true, because the electromagnetic force is, I forget the time, something like 150 trillion times stronger than gravity or something.
Yeah, and of course we are, becoming more aware of electrical events that do happen in terms of sunspots and such like, and mobile phone signals, for example.
Yeah, that's right, and so we are now more in a more diverse energy environment, and that's a whole other area of things like electromagnetic radiation pollution and people's sensitivity to that. But I think going back to this underlying, one of the final secrets I think that comes out of the study of 9/11 is that the black budget programs are able to engineer the underlying fabric of our reality. I call it ether physics. They're able to actually pull things apart at the level beneath the level of atoms and molecules. They're able to manipulate that environment, and that's how they destroyed the towers. And if you look into this and look at the history of this, I've been reading quite recently for some very interesting work by Roger Anderton, who looks into the history of Einstein's research up to about 1919, where he's documenting that Einstein's theory was actually changed. The original theory that Einstein came out with
Mm-hmm.
is not the same as what's in the textbooks now. In other words, Einstein was talking about an underlying ether, and they had to get rid of that idea, and also James Clerk Maxwell, he talked about the underlying ether, but then this other mathematician called Heaviside, he came along and he took out all these ideas of the underlying ether and got rid of them. And I think that history has now gone into black programs, and that's how they do what they did to the World Trade Center and propulsion systems, for example.
Yeah, and I mean to come back to that also has geopolitical effects. If you take what Edgar Fouché was mentioning in terms of our oil-based economy and some of the damage that's being done to the environment, often for the exploitation, as we spoke about when Gordon Bowden was on, of fake oil companies and dirty drilling projects, when actually in the black budget side of things, there may well be money that we've already spent that can cover at least some of that damage.
I think that's right. I mean, if you look at the whole situation with oil and the oil economy, of course, it stands to reason that if people were to get clued in on the fact that this whole oil thing is a scam, just like the cancer treatments are all just a business. It's nothing to do with curing people. It's about making money. It's the same with oil. It's not about delivering a product which enables human beings to live their lives. It's not about that at all. It's about enslaving them. And if we had this free energy technology, this ether physics openly, the world would just not be like this. We would probably all have our own independent way of doing things, and we wouldn't need a lot of these systems which we're forced into.
And I know that the more we ask those kind of questions, the more we work out what the evidence is, what the facts are, and back those sources, then the more empowered we are to hit the acupuncture points to hopefully bring about real change. Your website is checktheevidence.com, and you also people can get hold of you in a couple of other ways as well. Yeah,
I'm on Facebook, so you can just put obviously Andrew Johnson's a pretty common name, so you probably get 50 million Andrew Johnsons on Facebook. But I don't know, if you put in some other keywords, you'll find me through the website anyway, and and that sort of thing. And I'm doing a talk next week in High Wycombe, not ever so far away from London. If anybody's in that area, that's just at like a local pub. It's not like a big fancy event or anything like that. And it just be, I think it'd be like £3 or £5 just to on the door to cover the expenses of travel and stuff like that. And you're speaking at the excellent Exopolitics conference in 18th of October, is that right? That's slated for the 18th, I think is a Saturday. So yeah, if people want to go to that, we'll have some interesting talks there. Well, Andrew, we're almost at the end of the show. I want to thank you ever so much for coming on. And
yeah, I just wanted to say, really fascinating show. I haven't chipped in much, but I've been taking it all in, and thank you ever so much for coming. And I was really struck by, because once you've seen the hard evidence that the information you've been given, some of it isn't true, even if you've only seen that once from the powers that be, then you can't have to question everything. You're never quite sure. And what we need is the transparency, isn't it? We just need the information given to us so we can work it out ourselves. We don't need to be told. We just need to be shown. But yes, I think that's it. And then just be aware of if somebody's trying to put a certain spin on it, or one of the key phrases is perception management, which we started to talk a little bit about that. But that's what Apollo was. It was perception management about space, science, and technology.
Yeah, and it's once you start asking those on the face of the questions that you start getting some crazy answers. And yeah, thank you very much for coming on this evening. It's been great talking to you, mate.
Oh, likewise. Thanks for inviting me.
And hopefully, maybe in the future, we can talk a little bit more about some of those subjects that we haven't covered on the Bunker Show. A little bit more about seeing through the psyops and the media spin out there. Maybe a little bit more into some of the health cover-up. But stay tuned on Dark City, because we've got the Cannabis Compassion Club coming up with Martin, Edward, Sarah and Bob, and the show's dedicated to stepping out of the system, and Dean Oliver will be talking to the panel about how they can use self-empowerment and self-healing to break free of the barriers placed upon us. And after that is the Max Steel Show. Thank you for joining us, Andrew. We're going to be signing out of the bunker. Look forward to catching you all next week, where we're going to be having David Henke from XRO News.
Yeah, and if you all get a chance, watch the Australian 60 Minutes that aired last night on YouTube, okay, because that could be a good prelude.
And sign Chris Spivey's petition as well. Thank you very much and good night.
An idea that exists in the heart.
Okay. 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 Okay.